And when we thought of this campaign, my first thought was, we're really asking a lot of individuals. We'll be fortunate if we get 100 Anglicans to get involved with this. Well, we got 400. And all 5 of our bishops were involved in it. We used this, it became a front page article in our Anglican newspaper. So everybody heard about it. And it was amazingly popular, amazingly effective. Of the 400 who were involved, many were involved in the more affluent parishes we have, in the more areas where, maybe I'll say, not that far from where we are right now. North central Toronto, not, frankly, areas which have been hotbeds of activism in the church. And not only did people go on the diet, and incidentally, the way it worked is we gave them a list of, here's what you would get if you went to the food bank as an individual. Here's what you get as a family. And then we urged people to go to the supermarket to purchase the food. Obviously not to go to a food bank to take away food from people who really, really needed it. And then to go on the diet if they could as a congregation, as a parish. And then perhaps at the end to have an evaluation event. And it led to a lot of debate, dialogue, online debate on parish websites. One of the parishes at the end, they had a celebratory meal and they made a video about it. It was very powerful. Then we put that video up on our website for the diocese, so it had a ripple effect far, far beyond. And of course it meant that when we went to the government, we do a brief to the legislature about what we want to see in the budget for the next year. We could say, we know, some of our members know firsthand what it's like to have to go, to eat at food banks. So that's one thing we did. That worked really well. The other thing, moving to the less hard tactics, is we've encouraged a number of our parishes that have used this board game, the poverty game. It's, if you liked playing Monopoly when you were little, it's kind of the activist answer to Monopoly. As with Monopoly, you get a supply of fake money, but you take on the persona of somebody living on social assistance, somebody with a name, or somebody working at minimum wage, and then with your supply of money, as you roll the dice, you land on the different squares, you pick a card, and those cards give you the decisions that somebody actually faces in real life. Next week it's your best friend's birthday. Can you afford to buy her a present? Winter's approaching. Your son needs a new pair of winter boots. They cost $30. Do you have the money to buy them? And very soon you realize how, when you're impoverished, you face questions like that all the time. And your life is really, really isolated because you can't afford to go to a restaurant with your friends. You can't go to the coffee shop. We have, by the way, somebody, one of our very committed Anglican volunteers, has offered he's an educator. He will lead a group through the poverty game because at the end of the game, you're led through an exercise about how did you feel. Here are some of the issues around poverty in our society, and here are some of the campaigns about it. So it's, and we have the game, by the way, online, so we're able to send out all the files you would need. That's something. The next action idea I would suggest is to serve and eat at a community meal program for low-income folks. Like the one in Woodbine Heights Baptist in the East End of Toronto, or the Church of the Redeemer, where I happen to be a member. So I stress this would not be kind of a traditional exercise of a group of volunteers simply going to a meal program and serving a meal. But the thing is, I think that's more meaningful, is to, serving a meal is great, but the important thing is to then to eat with low-income folks, speak to them, try to start building relationships. And in our experience, I put this down as medium hard because it's not the easiest thing to do. It's a lot easier. I would have to say for myself, it's easier to serve a meal than to try to engage in a real human level, the way we were encouraged this morning to see all of us as real individuals. And then my last action idea is what I would call the easy one. Why not read a book like the one that's still for sale that we heard about this morning, Living Justice, that has reflections on poverty, prayers, action ideas as a group. Or another one that you might want to read is Persistent Poverty, a very powerful, hard-hitting one that grew out of a series of hearings held across the province by people who are low income, what their lives are like. And when I say read it as a group, say at your congregation or parish, it would be great, yes, if your outreach committee read the book as a group, but why not try to get your Christian education committee or a larger group in the parish to read it as a group? That way, that's a way to reach folks that are perhaps not as involved and engaged in this issue. And this idea occurred to me because the Church of the Redeemer, where I go, is fairly large, and we often will get 80 or 100 parishioners to read a book, usually about a theological one, if you will. And that's great. But it occurred to me, what if we got even half that number, half of those 80 folks, reading a book like this, and then having a discussion, how did you feel? What are some action ideas we could do as a parish? That's a way to, to grow the number of people that are actively engaged in this issue. I'll move on now to some of the advocacy ideas we've done that you might find helpful. One of the most helpful things I think we've done is 3 times in the last 8 years, we have organized Anglican and ecumenical delegations to meet almost all of the 43 NPPs, nearly half the number in the Ontario legislature, delegations to meet them around specific goals and proposals around either housing issues or poverty issues. To go into the meeting and say, we live in your area, the parishes and congregations we are from represent 8,000 or whatever number of people who live in your riding. We're concerned about the fact that 400,000 people in the province have to go to food banks. We know you share our concerns, and how can we work on this? And those meetings have been really, I think, important. One former member of the legislature, a Liberal, I'll never forget when we had our meeting with him. You could tell he was supportive during the meeting. Then the meeting ended, we started walking out, and we were almost at the door, and he said, "Thank you for speaking up for those who don't have a voice." And it was one of the most moving moments I've had in my life as an activist. The way he said that really showed that he, as a politician, he of course is used to people coming to him who want this, they want that, usually either for themselves, their family, a group in society. But my sense is not that many politicians have people who come to them, not so much for something they want for themselves, but more to say, we are concerned about a group in our society that are really hard hit by the housing shortage, by their low incomes, what have you. The other idea that we've used that has been quite innovative, I think, is to use congregation or parish annual meetings to educate people around an outreach or advocacy issue. Anglicans, we call our annual meetings vestry meetings. We like to use words that nobody else who's not Anglican knows what you're talking about too much of the time. Then we wonder why we're losing members. But seriously, at our vestry meetings, a former member, Parliament by the way, who is Anglican, came up with this idea. So for instance, at the annual parish meetings last year, the motion said, the vestry of name of parish urges the Government of Ontario to immediately introduce a $100 per month healthy food supplement for all adults on social assistance so that they can afford more nutritious food and live a life of greater dignity. So notice it's a simple motion, it's phrased in non-partisan language, and about 80 of the 200 parishes in the diocese endorsed that motion. And what did that accomplish? Well, a number of things. One is it brought the issue before a fairly large group of individuals who learned about it, they had debate, and then of the parishes that supported the campaign, they represent around 30,000 Anglicans. Then we could go to the government and say, we want you to bring in $100 a month increase for those on social assistance in the budget. And incidentally, we know that there's a fair amount of support for this in our recent annual meetings. 80 parishes supported it, representing 30,000 Anglicans. We are preparing for our annual meetings, our vestry meetings for the coming year. They'll start early in the new year. And the motion for that campaign is around a federal issue, the new refugee bill that's come in, Bill C-31, that some of you don't know that it's causing a lot of concern about threats to people like the Roma who may be severely impacted. Those are a couple of things that have really worked well for us. I have brought with me a couple of copies of the report of the last round of NPP visits we carried out, if anybody would like to see them. The last advocacy tactic I would say that's really worked well is just to be really mindful of what are the regional groups in your area you could be part of, like a local ministerial. I know that there's ecumenical networks in areas like Etobicoke, North Toronto, almost anywhere. And if we band together, our voices are certainly a lot more powerful than they are when we only speak as an individual congregation. Then there are the larger networks like the 25 and 5 network for poverty reduction that led to Ontario's poverty reduction strategy. Yes, a lot more has to happen to attain the goals of the strategy, but the thing is that led to a significant mobilization. It got the poverty issue out there in a way that it hadn't been for a long while. And incidentally, you will be hearing, hopefully, in a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, about a similar campaign to both recommit the province around a poverty reduction strategy, and in the interim to work on some of the goals of the recently released social assistance report that has a lot of good ideas. And I think the last thing I would like to say before handing over to Sherry is I think it's really important to remind ourselves that we are not powerless. This is something we have to counter all the time, that, you know, there's no point raising our voices. The government's going to do whatever it wants to do and not do usually what we want it to do. And I think the problem is that we've convinced ourselves, too many of us, that we are powerless. And we need to remind ourselves that we have a lot of power. And of course, in the environmental movement, we got an amazingly heartening example of the power we have just this past week with the victory on the mega quarry. How did that happen? Lots of people mobilized, you know, throughout that region, in that farming region, in the Toronto area. It involved an amazingly wide group of people, like chefs. Usually when you think of social activists, your mind wouldn't normally think of, oh yeah, we got to get the chefs on board. But I mentioned that, you know, there's celebrity chefs who were involved with things like food stock, you know, a creative event, to say that that's an example of when we think about working on these issues, you know, besides, you know, if you will, the usual suspects, we need to think about, well, who are all the people who might be interested and engaged in this issue, and how can we reach out to them? How would we be able to get them on board? Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. The last thing I'll say, the other resource I have here, I brought a few copies of. We've got we as Anglicans have produced a new copy of what we call a social justice and advocacy outreach guide. And it's a way for a parish or a congregation outreach committee to think about their work, to learn about some new ideas for things we've carried out, and to think about how you allocate the money you have. Often with this kind of work, it's easy for an outreach committee, and I guess I'm presuming a lot of you are perhaps involved in the outreach committee for your congregation. It's easy to get, as with a lot of our lives, to get into kind of habits, doing kind of the same things over and over. So there's some ideas here for some new ways of working, and so if you'd like a copy, I've got a few of them here. Okay, I'll hand over to Sharon.
Well, first, let's give them a round of applause because Murray's like a one-man campaign and has been for years. He's one of those folk who everyone knows him in Queen's Park. I'm sure everyone knows him in politics now, and he has single-handedly done a phenomenal job on putting poverty on the agenda for everyone. So actually, give him another round of applause. So I'm going to be talking about how to win, really, on this issue, which is similar to any other issue. And I'm glad you brought up the mega quarry, because that was going to be the example I led off with. That's a phenomenal win. That's a huge win against a huge hedge fund out of New York. The odds were not even by any stretch of the imagination, neither were the finances, and yet we won that. To me, there are three elements of winning a campaign for any issue, and this is independent of the issue. It seems to me as a politician there are three things that always happen for a winning campaign. Number one, you have a media that's interested in covering it. We haven't talked a lot about media today, but I have to say that media, and in particular in our instance where social justice is concerned, there is only one newspaper that really is the critical key here, and that's the Toronto Star. Not because I'm a Toronto Star fan over any other publication, it's simply the single biggest daily in Canada, and because of its bent, tends to let its reporters go after an issue and dig their teeth into it. So a media that's behind you, a media that's on board with the story, a media that will cover it. That's become almost critical on any issue. Number two is legislative action. It all has to kind of dovetail into something that's going to force a government to do something, right? The mega quarry was, we were yelling and screaming. Actually, both opposition parties, Conservatives and us, about the mega quarry. Finally forced the government to do an environmental assessment. That slowed the whole thing down, and that was the beginning of a steamroller. But it has to have some kind of legislative face. I don't think that's the most important piece, by the way. I think, if anything, it's the least important piece. But it does have to have that bill or that motion or that action that you're asking a government to do, and they do eventually. And polling. It has to poll. It has to, across the board, there have to be a lot of people who know about it, who are behind it, and who are loud about it. There are some exceptions to this, but let's focus on the tried and the true. And this is the tried and the true. I call it kind of the here, there, and everywhere syndrome for getting an issue before folk and getting people to think about it. It's kind of top of the mind issues. Which, by the way, brings me to an aside, and that is polling. Poverty and the environment, two themes of today, if there were some on issues, have never polled well in this province. They are, if you ask any pollster what are top of the mind issues, when they phone people up, whatever pollster it is, they'll tell you jobs and the economy are always at the top of the list on people's minds, and this will be true of your congregants as well. Jobs and the economy, and way, way down the list is the environment and poverty. Way down, way down. Healthcare is way up there, education's up there, poverty and the environment way, way down. Which is kind of counterintuitive for us, because that's all we, we're people of faith, and we exist in congregations, and we think that because we think this way, everybody does, and they don't. And this is a criticism, a self-criticism as much as anything else. It means we have far more work to do to get that message out. But we have some allies. Again, I go back to the media and the legislation on this. So let me talk about touching base with the legislators, the politicians. How to get a politician to do what you want them to do? Well, let me tell you how politics works. First of all, I gave you the oversight of the politician this morning. They're human beings like any other. They're motivated by the same things you are. They're not in it for the money. They're not bad people per se. This is their job, just like you have a job, etc. One thing politicians have to do, though, and all political parties, and that is get reelected. So there's the ideology. That's important. And there's getting reelected, and that's the job at hand. And any good campaign manager will tell you when one campaign starts, the next begins. And so life is a campaign in politics. Anybody tells you anything else ain't telling you the truth. They have to get reelected. How do you get reelected? Well, again, there's polls. So now what do? Do you pander to the polls? In other words, if you're hearing jobs in the economy? And the answer, quite simply, is yes. Most political parties will pander to the polls. Most political parties, and I'll make you a bet on this, in the next election, which will probably be provincial, but it could be, who knows, next election, you'll hear jobs in the economy as the issues, the critical issues on everybody's platform. And most political parties will run on 3 or 4 key points. That's all. That's all pollsters and researchers have shown that people hold in their minds. 3 or 4 key promises, key points, and those points you can bet will be around jobs, the economy, healthcare, and maybe education, depending on the issues in the riding. Poverty and environment will be down here. Federal, provincial, the same. These are the same kinds of issues that permeate even municipally, right? Everywhere. So when you're talking to a politician, when you go in to lobby them about one of those issues that's way down at the bottom of the key in terms of polling, the environment and poverty, you might get the polite nod. And you might even get some empathy, but you may not get action. You may not get action because that's not going to help them get reelected. I can tell you what I'm hearing at the door. And by the way, one of the best ways of figuring out what people are thinking is to get involved yourself in a campaign of some sort. It doesn't really matter which party. Knock on those doors. Talk to people. Talk to them in your congregations. Talk to them out there. And if it's about an environmental or poverty issue, go out there and talk to people. And I can tell you what you will hear for folk. It's partly a spiritual conundrum we're in right now. People are frightened. People are scared. The middle class is emptying out, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The middle class is 1 or 2 paychecks away from being poor themselves. And as good faith leaders in this room, you will know that nothing generous and good comes out of fear. A frightened population is not a population that's going to be showing generosity to those on social assistance. A frightened population, first of all, the first thing you have to do is calm them down before you could even have a conversation about something that's not directly related to them paying their bills at the end of the month. And that's the fear people have. We are phenomenally in debt in this country, individually. Our lifestyles and our standards of living are falling in free fall. I always use the example of my parents' generation. My mother and father lived on one salary, downtown Toronto. On one salary, they could afford a house and a car in the driveway, and lucky among them, a cottage. Now, my generation, 2 salaries to afford a house, and you probably lease your car, and only the wealthy can afford a cottage. My children's generation, good luck. On 2 salaries, maybe they'll be able to afford a condo, and won't buy a car, they'll never own either, and only the super rich will be able to afford a cottage. That's 2 generations of Canadians. And then we're going to talk to these people and we're going to say, yeah, but what about the person on social assistance? The idea doesn't permeate. What about the environment? They don't care, they want a job and they want security. This is what affects voting patterns. So know the atmosphere in which you are. And as faith leaders, we are perfectly positioned to speak to that fear. Because what is it that we do? Those famous lines of Jesus, do not fear. Fear not. Come on, fear not. So the first message we have to get to people, this is the pastoral part, is to talk people back from the edge because they're frightened. And when you talk them back from the edge, when you give them some hope, then you can begin to talk about those other things. Similar with politicians. They're just people, remember? So their fear of not getting reelected, out of a job, 2 paychecks away from, losing their house. So you're going to talk to the politician and you're going to, first of all, address their fear of not getting reelected. You're going to tell them it's not about them. So you don't hate them because they're conservative, or you don't hate them because they're a liberal, you don't hate them because they're a New Democrat. You're there for them. You're there to help them. You're there to give them the tools to speak about something that probably in their hearts they want to do something about. So you're going to provide them the figures, the numbers, the facts. Here's the facts that I don't often hear from anti-poverty activists. How much does poverty cost our province? How many of you know that figure? How much does it cost to build new housing as a government? If you put money into housing, how much of that money do you get back in some form? I can tell you, for example, in Quebec, where they put money into childcare, where you can get $7 a day childcare, that's beginning to pay for itself because women are entering the workforce and they're paying taxes. The retrofit program that the federal government ran for a while paid for itself. That was a conservation plan, paid for itself because contractors came out from the underground, had to actually give you a receipt. They had to actually start paying taxes in the black market. That program paid for itself. Those are the figures, because every politician, particularly those in government, will want costing figures. How much will it cost? Will it be recouped? Explain to me as an economist would, or even as a bookkeeper would, how do we pay for this? How do we pay for $100 extra for social assistance? But don't be deterred when they tell you we can't afford it. We would love to do it. Here's a classic political answer you'll get. We would love to give $100 extra to someone on social assistance, but we can't afford it because we've got a $14 billion deficit and all these problems, and it's polling down here and nobody cares, and that's not where people want to see us put their money, tax dollars, right? They don't want to see it go into social assistance, and they don't want to see it go into the environment. They want to see it go into job creation. Okay, so then you have to prove, and be willing to prove, why this will help the deficit. Why poverty reduction will help the deficit. Why it will create jobs. These are the kinds of facts that you need to have, and they're available. There's all sorts of examples in your handouts. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, great source for stats on how much poverty costs, on why you can't just think about it as column in and column out, how you have to think about it as seed money, and then you get the money back in return. And examples of where they do it better. Everybody wants an example. So where does it work? And I'll give you some. Scandinavian countries. Just look at Sweden. No poverty, virtually no poverty. They don't have poverty. When the Swedish delegation came over here, somebody wondered what they'd like to see and suggested they go see a food bank, and they said, why do you put food in banks? They don't have food banks in Sweden, okay? Everybody has a house. They built 100,000 new units of housing a year for a population of 9 million. We have 13 million in Ontario. They have free post-secondary education. In fact, they pay you to go to school. They have free childcare. They have an 85% unionization rate, and the workers at McDonald's are unionized, and if they weren't, nobody'd eat there, and they get way more than we do in terms of minimum wage. And how do they do it? Well, guess what? Taxes. But guess what? The taxes on the middle class are no higher than here. It's wild, eh? They're no higher than here for the middle class. What you have is a more progressive tax system and all of those things you heard about in terms of taxing the wealthy and other ways of getting at tax dollars, right? But know the examples of where they do it better and have these facts and figures so you can have a real discussion with somebody who's very much concerned about these things. That gives your politician the tools to go to his or her caucus, because that's the next step for them, to fight for what you want, because you've provided them with the tools and they don't have time to find out for themselves. And then that caucus can then go in and fight with the other, the other political parties if he or she is successful, and that's how change can happen legislatively, right? And again, I have to say, I think that the $100 a month for social assistance, that increase, that one single ask of the Social Assistance Review, of which 108 asks or so, that single one, keep it simple. Ask for one thing. Don't ask for 108 things. Chances are, after two, nobody's paying attention. Ask for one thing, your campaign's about one ask, and back it up with all of the research I just suggested, and make that your ask, and make it black and white for people. Sign on or don't sign on. It's very simple. You're with us or you're against us. With us or you're against us. That puts incredible pressure on individual politicians. It puts incredible pressure on political parties, and it puts incredible pressure on the legislative process. Because then, when you stand up at the all candidates meetings at the mic and you say, we asked you if you were in favor of a $100 a month increase in social assistance, end of story, and you wouldn't sign. Or, and you would. Great. This is easy, it's simple. Keep it straightforward. We can work on the other 107 asks later, or the committee that will sift through them to get that done. So I would say in the poverty thing, similarly in the environmental movement, with the mega quarry is a perfect example. If those mega quarry activists had focused on every other climate change possibility and everything else wrong with the climate, right? But you focus on the mega quarry, stop that now. That's the demand, stop that now, win. In my riding, I'm focused on clean electric trains versus diesel. It's very simple. That's where the climate hits the road, so to speak. In my riding, it's those trains, air rail link. And it's very, very particular to a riding, and it's very, very important to the people who live next to those tracks. One issue, fight issues, don't fight campaigns. So I would suggest that. If it's climate change, I would suggest, what is it you really, really want? What would make the biggest bang for the buck in terms of climate change? What's the one thing you want this government to do? And of course you do that in consultation, right? What do you think you can win too? And back to the media. And of course visiting. Everybody should know their MP and their MPP and their city councillor by name. And they should know you by name. And they should know what you stand for and that you're there, here, there, and everywhere. Everywhere they go. Already talked about that. And the nonpartisan aspect of this is that ISARC, where poverty is the focus, of course, and social assistance is the focus. And Toby Barrett for the Progressive Conservatives got up and talked about what the Progressive Conservatives would do. Didn't mention the $100, but he did, interestingly enough, talk about ending the clawbacks on ODSP, ending the clawbacks on child support. He actually, in his speech, made some pretty firm commitments from the Progressive Conservative Party, which were more than the Liberal government has done. Okay? So this is not partisan. This is, we want commitments from you, and then, you know, let's work from there. You also heard, he also says a very interesting thing, which is an insight into the mind of conservative, I think, which is that he was very, very interested in what faith groups thought. Very interested, especially Christian faith groups, because you can see where this is going, and use as an example how charity used to be delivered only through faith groups. So, to me, I'm listening between the lines and I'm thinking, okay, that sort of makes sense. You know, Harper, Christian right, blah, 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 sort of making sense. Here is a wonderful opportunity for faith groups. Christian faith groups, speaking as Christian faith groups to conservative MPs and MPPs, saying this is what, as Murray said, our diocese decided. This is what my church decided. And don't forget about the polling, the numbers. Murray's absolutely right. 30,000 Anglicans think this way. You know, 100,000 people think this way. Here's proof, you know, of the tip of the iceberg. So appeal to where they're trying to take you, right? And in the Conservative Party, if you happen to have a Conservative that is in charge of your riding, here's a great insight into clearly what's developing at Queen's Park in terms of the way Conservatives are thinking about poverty and what to do about it. What else? Well, just to sum up. So, know how politics works, know how politicians work, be here, there, and everywhere. The three critical things: media, an advocate in the media, legislative action, and consensus among the population on an issue. You know the time is right when you've got those three things working. I'll give you one final example just before I stop, and that's, I've just brought forward a bill, well, it's fourth time I tabled this bill, on post-traumatic stress disorder for frontline workers. EMS, firefighters, police, there's another group in there. Oh, and correctional officers. Huge numbers of post-traumatic stress disorder complaints at the WSIB. Impossible to prove you got it from your job, almost. And yet, like soldiers, this kills people in great numbers. I tabled that bill 3 times. Did anybody care? And it was just supported by the paramedics initially. It was a paramedic who walked into my office who told me, who suffered from it and told me about it. No, nobody cared. 4th time, this bill was on the front page of the Toronto Star above the fold of my picture. Why? What was the difference between the 4th time and the other 3 times? That's a bill I know will pass because of what I've just told you. I know it will pass. Why? Because there's a reporter on the Star who wants to make this his signature issue. Great. He's the one that came into my office and said, I hear you tabled a bill. Are you going to be tabling it again? I said, I am now, you know. That plus that media, plus then the Police Association of Ontario came on board supporting it. Then the firefighters came on board, made it a key ask. Then the prison guards came and said, we're frontline workers too. They made it a key ask. All of a sudden, sitting on a panel at Queen's Park at Oppressor is 100,000 people. People with a lot of clout. So will that bill pass this? I know it will at some point. I know. The only question is when right now. So the 3 critical issues that weren't there when I first tabled a bill that are there now. So, and this has worked with every bill I've ever got through. It's a similar kind of trajectory. And federal politicians will tell you the same. So you have your work cut out for you. Godspeed. It's God's work. Thank you.